Queensland Senator Matt Canavan, the former Resources Minister, is across both of these issues. He joins me live now from Canberra. All right, Senator, let's start at the beginning here, because I think we use a lot of terms that people might be catching up on. What's meant by net zero emissions? We're not talking about zero emissions, are we? I've talked before about offsets, and I've read some carbon prices. We're talking $273 a tonne. Help us understand it all.
Yes, well, it's very important to understand this, Peter, and the net in net zero basically means that those that are rich enough, that have the means to themselves continue to buy offsets, can continue to emit carbon emissions, can continue to fly overseas on their holidays, can continue to go up to Davos if that's what they like to do, to lecture others about climate change, can continue to drive around even in cars themselves, as long as they have the means to buy offsets which net off their carbon impact on the world. So it's effectively like a modern form of indulgence. You know, in the medieval times, people could still sin. You could do whatever sins you'd like. Even popes could sin, as long as you could afford to go to the right person and buy an indulgence for those sins. And that's what these plans are trying to do. The problem with this, though, is that the form of indulgence that will be paid for is growing more trees on otherwise productive farmland in rural and country areas of our country. So the CSIRO report that the Labor Party has been referring to endlessly this week itself shows that to meet net zero by 2050 in Australia, we'd need to lock up 24 million hectares of land. In their own report, the CSIRO say that there'll be a substantial decline in agricultural production replaced with the planting of trees, and that will mean thousands of jobs lost in country areas, because you won't have jobs in sugar mills, you won't have jobs in cotton gins, you won't have jobs in meat processing plants, and we'll have to import food because everything will have to be locked up in the form of trees, just so people can have a warm glow in the inner cities.
All right, well, countries where we know there has been modelling in relation to this commitment, New Zealand's a prime example. They have the commitment, net zero, by 2050, but it comes with some considerable carve-outs. Now, we've looked at some of the economics there. The economics for New Zealand's government was undertaken by the Institute of Economic Research. It's got some pretty heroic assumptions in there, like suddenly there'll be a vaccine that stops the sheep burping and farting, less methane. This vaccine has never been thought of before, but it'll be there and it'll save New Zealand. And it also says that 50% of all trucks in New Zealand will be electric by 2050. This is Pollyanna stuff.
Yeah, well, that's the assumptions they make, and in fairness to the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, they were asked to make those assumptions by New Zealand government officials, and there are pains in their report to say that they weren't their view of the future of the world. That was what they were asked and commissioned to do. But even with those heroic assumptions about future technologies, which make getting to net zero easier than otherwise, the costs on the New Zealand economy in this New Zealand Government Commission modelling is enormous. So this modelling, this economic modelling, shows that the economic impact to New Zealand will be something between 10 to 20% on their GDP. If you want to put that in Australian dollar terms, that would mean $200 to $400 billion. Our economy is $2 trillion economy. Employment would fall by 2 to 4%. That's hundreds of thousands of jobs here in Australia if employment would fall by those percentages. And wages would be down by up to 30%. That's like $25,000 in the Australian context. Now a year. Now, obviously, the impact on Australia would probably be worse because we have a large coal and gas industry that New Zealand doesn't have. But we don't have those numbers because the Labor Party has proposed a policy without any costings, without any analysis, with zero consultation with the farm sector, with mining sector, and is just trying to say, trust us, we can have our cake, we can eat it too, we can still have coal mining jobs, we can cut our emissions to zero, and apparently we'll never get fat and we'll all be rich as well.
But of course, with the New Zealand example, they've carved out agriculture. This is all smoke and mirror stuff.
That's right. So the modelling doesn't. Just to be clear, the modelling the New Zealand Government Commission included agriculture and the impact. Presumably when the numbers came back and showed that the dairy industry would more than halve in New Zealand if it was applied to the agricultural sector, I presume some New Zealand MPs probably found a bit of a backbone and decided that would be a step too far. So in the end, the Ardern government exempted exempted agriculture completely from their net zero target, and agriculture accounts for 48% of New Zealand's carbon emissions. So it really is literally a job done by half in New Zealand. Now, this is where I think really people need to call out the hypocrisy and the misleading statements that are made on these issues. The New Zealand government likes to signal its virtue on a range of issues, including apparently its attempts to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide emissions in New Zealand since 2005 have barely changed. They've gone down a little bit if you include land use changes, but only a little bit. And they are now trying to hoodwink everybody by saying, well, we haven't done anything in the last 15 years to meet our Kyoto or to reduce carbon emissions, but trust us, in 30 years' time we'll go all the way to zero.
Senator Canavan,
or net zero.
Senator Canavan, this is the scourge of world assessments on this issue, because there were first of all, there were Kyoto targets and 2020 targets. Most countries didn't meet them. Australia did, and we want to be able to use where we meet them and bettered them to roll over into the 2030 targets, and we're being pilloried for it. But of course, more countries haven't or are not on track to meet 2030 than are on track to meet 2030. So they're pushing the finishing line out to 2050, uncosted, unplanned, and certainly lack of scrutiny on the current leaders, because for most countries, certainly Australia, that's 10 elections away. The report out in the UK overnight, I talked about it at the top of the show. It's a report from the Global Warming Policy Institute, but we're talking about £82,000 per household right across the United Kingdom in increased electricity and heating costs. $160,000 in our money. Who can afford that? That's over 6 times the pension in Australia.
Well, clearly it won't happen, Peter. I mean, we saw in France a couple of years ago, as soon as the Macron government just tried a little bit to reduce fuel use, petrol use, by increasing taxes on petrol there in France, there was an absolute riot, and Paris was shut down for weeks at an end with the yellow vest movement, and they eventually dropped it and backed down. And this is where I suppose Australia cops a bit of a penalty, because I think we are a country that stands up to our word, that we do as what we say, and we've made commitments under Kyoto. We're meeting those. We are faithfully implementing the Paris Agreement commitments too, but we are doing so in a realistic fashion. Other countries in the world sign up to these things, say they're going to do them, and then go along merrily building coal-fired power stations like no tomorrow. So I do think we should keep our word as a country, and we should be realistic and upfront with the Australian people. The Labor Party are not doing that, because they're trying to sell a magic pudding to the Australian people. But we'll back our word, we'll back realistic targets, and we'll set about achieving them in a way that doesn't smash the Australian economy.
Matt Canavan, just before we go, what do you want the Prime Minister to do here? Because right now, your government has net zero emissions by 2050 on the table.
Well, I don't think we should do it. I just don't think any of the evidence stacks up here to go down this path for our country. There's been no proper costings done, but even if there were, based on the evidence that we've got from overseas, it is not the right time to do this for our nation. What we should be doing is keeping other nations' foot to the fire here to commit to what they have done now. Why would we sign up to effectively unilaterally do more action in this country while other countries like New Zealand, like Canada, like many European nations are not meeting the commitments they've actually said they would do? That's what we should be doing and saying to the world, because this hypocrisy has got to end, and we're in favour of real action, as the saying goes, not just all talk. The other thing here I'd make is, you'd know this well, Peter, we have our structure of government. As soon as these kind of commitments get set, the bureaucrats go very busily to make sure there's a hurdle against anything happening, because apparently we've signed up to something. They tried this with Paris. That they said that once we signed up to Paris, we had to reduce emissions in a linear fashion, and that was all rubbish. We didn't actually sign up to that, but you give them an inch here and they take a mile, and the people who pay the price are often those in country and rural areas, who the Labor Party and the Greens Party don't mind them paying the price, because they don't live in those areas.
Love your clarity. I have to remind people at home that Paris is a non-binding agreement, but you wouldn't know that if you went into the bowels of the Environment Department and the Treasury Department in Canberra. Matt Canavan, thanks for your time tonight.